Mr. and Mrs. Evans had a wonderful trip over and certainly enjoyed their opportunity to be here and visit with you last Sabbath, and then at the picnic they had a good trip back home, and as far as I heard from them once since they returned, and everything went well. Well, you know, considering the weather we've had, if we had to have the air conditioning be on the fritz someday, I can't think of a better Sabbath that we've had of recent time than today. I can sure think of some that would have been a whole lot worse. So hopefully this won't happen again. Sort of leads me into something. The news article that came out of U.S. News and World Report back just a matter of a few weeks ago. And the article was entitled, "The World's Hottest Year in Over a Century." For over 100 years, the world's average temperature seesawed up and down, usually by tiny fractions of degrees. But since the mid-1970s, the mercury has largely been on the rise. Last year, the average global surface temperature monitored at thousands of sites around the world climbed 0.7 of a degree above a yardstick average that was set between 1961 and 1990. As a result, the United Nations World Meteorological Organization last week declared 1995 the hottest year on record. And many scientists, of course, wonder whether human beings are egging on so-called global warming, and there's a lot of controversy over that. But what is not controversial in the sense that it's just simply a statement of fact is that 1995 was the driest summer in 3 centuries in England and Wales. They have records going back for centuries there. And it was the driest summer, 1995, in 3 centuries. Spain hit 117 degrees in July, which was the hottest that they had ever had recorded. A heat wave scorched the Northeast and Midwest in the United States. Mercury hit 106 in Chicago, and more than 5,500 people died of heat-related distress at the time of the heat wave last summer. Russia and Central Asia experienced the warmest year on record. Regions of Siberia were 5 degrees hotter than average. The Atlantic Ocean experienced the most active hurricane season since 1933. In southern Africa, the wet season rains were below normal in those regions, and the rainfall was decreased by about 25% in parts of Brazil. Again, some very wet areas. So, you know, I don't know if you noticed, if it was in the newspaper over here on the religion page of the Baton Rouge paper this morning, they had an article, and they were interviewing various ones that were talking about natural disasters. Are these the harbinger of things to come and of the end times? And of course, they reached the conclusion, oh no, these, you know, we've always had storms and bad weather, and yes, we always have. We haven't always had we don't have the driest summer in 3 centuries every year, though. We don't have, in fact, we only have that every 3 centuries, right? It's not that you can point to any one of these specific things and say, well, that proves that this is the end of an age. However, when you take the circumstances and the weather and in the natural world around us and you put them with everything else, it is just one more indicator of the times in which we live. There was an article fairly recently, back in April, in the Los Angeles Times, and had sort of an interesting headline: U.S. officials quietly prepare for financial meltdown. How do you quietly prepare for something like that? Well, they were quietly preparing because they didn't want anybody to know they were preparing. That's why they were being quiet about it, because they were afraid that if people found out they were preparing, that they would jump to conclusions, and the next thing you know, you would have what they were preparing for. It reminds me of a number of years ago back in the, 1973, 74. I forget the exact month, but it was in that year. We were living back in Paducah, Kentucky, and those of you who remember that was the time of the gas crunch. That was the time of the Arab oil embargo, and that was the time when gasoline prices just shot out the ceiling. Now, you remember that one of the things that happened in that context was the independent truckers went on a strike because they said that that what was happening made it impossible. The government had some regulations in terms of rates, and they were in a squeeze, and they went on strike. Now, when you stop to consider what happens when trucks don't run, you don't have to let your imagination, what do we have that's trucked in? Well, just about everything you can think of. Gasoline's trucked in, food is trucked in. Word got out, of course, they were going on strike. In fact, some of them got pretty vociferous about enforcing their strikes. There was even a few sniper attacks on truckers that decided to run anyway. I remember very vividly because it was quite an impressive sight of seeing gasoline tank trucks being brought in to Paducah with an Army convoy. And they had, troop trucks in front and troop trucks behind, and they were running in, they were running in convoys, bringing in the gasoline tank trucks there. And that was sort of a chilling sight when you looked up and you realized that the state of society was so precarious that they felt the need to do that. They had called out the National Guard and were escorting some of these things. Word got out that there might be, as a result of the trucker strike, there would be a shortage of bread. And you can imagine what happened. There was a run on all the supermarkets there in Paducah, and within a day's time, there was no bread. Now, some people had a trunk full. They had 15 loaves, which probably half of which went bad. It was not really the solution to the problem, but it shows how easy it is to engender panic. People don't think there's going to be any, so they run down to the store and they clean out all that there is. And then, sure enough, there is none. And it took several days to sort of calm things down. And again, they brought in, they trucked out of another area to bring things in. But it goes to show, it was something that now as you look back, that's been over 20 years ago, and that's sort of a little blip on the screen. It didn't totally impact every part of the country as fully. But, we've had at various times, not just back during World War II, but later on during the 70s, gasoline rationing in many areas where you had certain days on which you could buy gasoline and other days that, that you couldn't. And there have been various things that have transpired. It's very easy for us in this country when we're comfortable to sort of sit back and think that those things will never inconvenience us. I'd like to read from, a little bit from this article in the LA Times in April. Last summer, as Republicans sought to confront President Clinton over the budget, a group of top U.S. officials began to ponder the unthinkable, a meltdown of the financial system, sparked by an unprecedented default of the United States Treasury. To the amazement of many, GOP hardliners in the House seemed willing to risk such an event if the nation's debt limit wasn't raised on their own terms. At least some talked as if they were. As attention focused on the escalating budget fight in Congress, a separate struggle involving Treasury Secretary Robert Rubin, Federal Reserve Board Chairman Alan Greenspan, and other high-level officials was unfolding far from the spotlight. The issue, whether the Fed should prepare for the financial debacle of a default, however unlikely, just as emergency officials prepare for an unexpected nuclear attack or a natural catastrophe that may never occur. On one side, Rubin and his top lieutenants at Treasury feared that Even a mere planning exercise would lend credence to the unthinkable idea and panic Wall Street if word leaked out. For their part, several Federal Reserve governors argued that it would be grossly irresponsible not to explore contingency plans. Ultimately, around late September, Rubin was prevailed upon to allow the secret planning exercise, apparently accepting the Fed governor's argument that there was little choice given the continuing confrontation with Congress and its uncertain outcome. It will remain a mystery whether such a default could have sparked the worst-case scenario, which would be a chain reaction paralyzing credit markets and even ordinary check-cashing operations, pushing up interest rates and disrupting the banking system. But behind the scenes, many officials worry about a more immediate problem, that a default might create a tidal wave of chaos, leaving banks unable to cash checks, many large corporations unable to meet their payrolls, and a multitude of other borrowers in limbo. If banks, money markets, and corporations were suddenly left holding large volumes of Treasury securities that had uncertain value, believe me, there would be an earthquake, said David Jones, chief economist at a New York investment firm. In many ways, however, the event would be electronic, unfolding along an intricate web of data pathways linking the Federal Reserve, major banks, and investment firms on Wall Street. Right along the same line, an article from Reuters had to do with debtor nations. The rich industrial nations on Monday warned debtor nations and global investors not to expect or near a free ride in the event of another economic crisis similar to the one that struck Mexico last year. They were responding to criticism about last year's $50 billion rescue package for Mexico. The fact that amounted to a bailout of the country and a bailout of wealthy Wall Street investors. They said neither debtor countries nor their private creditors should expect to be insulated from any adverse financial consequences in the event of a crisis. And this statement was issued after deliberations on the fringes of a semi-annual International Monetary Fund and World Bank meetings. Venezuela, which was seen as the possible flashpoint, cooled considerably when the IMF announced that it had reached an agreement on an economic package of $1.4 billion of a standby loan. Well, we could go on and on with some of those things. I think that when you look at many of these events that are transpiring on the world scene, you recognize the fact that there are many things that are building up, whether we're looking at the precarious state of the financial situation, whether you're looking at weather conditions, which ultimately is the basis of that's the basis of the economy. Because when you get down to everything else, all the other things, ultimately, all of the fancy means of exchange are simply a means of having something to exchange in order for food, clothing, and shelter. I don't care whether it's gold, silver, paper, or plastic. None of those things will suffice as food, clothing, or shelter, the most basic needs. They simply form a medium of exchange. That's something that somebody will accept in exchange for what you eat and what you wear and a place to live. So when the weather is out of kilter, when the harvests are threatened, then you're dealing with something that is at the fundamental issue in terms of the economy. Now, it's interesting that this year is in many ways a year of decision. We have just gone through an election in the state of Israel, and Russia is going through an election here in just a matter of a few days. What we have to realize is that on the one hand, there are crises building all over the world. And on the other hand, there are individuals being chosen who will be in office and who will be the ones to respond to those crises as they arise. Now, we're told in the book of Daniel that God sets over nations whomsoever He will, sometimes even the basest of men. There are individuals who are being set. There are individuals who are coming into position or who are being retained in place, who will be the individuals that will confront certain problems and certain crises as they build. Now, depending on the character of those men, depending on their abilities, depending on several things, things can get worse or can get better. So it's interesting as we see these things because the stage is being set. Now, exactly how long that's going to take, none of us know. But there are some things that are laid out very clearly, and there's some specific warnings to all of us. Now, when you look at the situation in the Middle East, you look at the election of Mr. Netanyahu as the new Prime Minister of Israel, one of the things to take note of is not simply his election, but the fact that in the parliamentary elections, the greatest increase of seats, of parliamentary seats, went to the seats of the Orthodox religious groups in Israel. That there was a significant increase in their parliamentary representation, and it's interesting as things are sort of still in the negotiating stage right now. How big a part are they going to play in the government? There are a lot of things going on behind the scenes that you and I don't see and don't know, but we will see the results of it within a relatively short period of time. And depending on on what happens, whether Labor and Likud make sort of a grand coalition, or whether Netanyahu's government is going to be more tied in with the religious parties in Israel, will be an indication about what's going to be happening next over there and how quickly it'll be happening. And the same thing in Russia. There are pressures that are building up, and the world is not going to swing back to some sort of bipolar world of a revived Soviet Union against the United States. That's not the way that things will ultimately go. There's going to be an increasing tie-in of Russia with Europe and a dependence there in terms of some of the things that are going to be building economically. Exactly the twists and turns it'll take between now and there, we'll have to wait and see. It'll be interesting, again, to see the results of the election. Of course, we're having elections in this country, and other nations are looking at some of these things. And there's an article recently from U.S. News. This was back a little over a year ago. But it shows some of what is building over in Europe. We look at what's happening in Russia. We look at what's happening in the Middle East. The article was entitled, "Push Comes to Shove. Western Europe is ailing, angry, and afraid of the future." Western Europe emerged from the Cold War victorious but utterly unprepared for the upheavals ahead. Global recession, technological change, the high cost of German reunification, and the surge of immigration dashed hopes that 1993 would bring economic growth and new jobs. It didn't. From Sweden to Spain, West Europeans are losing faith in their leaders, their political parties, and the ideals of social democracy that have guided them for half a century. Unemployment is reaching levels not seen since the 1930s. A sense pervades that communities are falling apart, values are collapsing, institutions are crumbling, nation-states weakening. High expectations after the end of the Cold War have given rise to bitter disappointments. People feel misled. That's part of the situation in Eastern Europe and in Russia right now. One article, this is a quote here from the President of the Italian Senate. The West has not been able to take advantage of the great victory over communism. It is in Russia that the process of decomposition of the internal order began. It is a reality that has unleashed all the religious and racial hatreds that have always characterized that society. Now the contagion westward seems unstoppable. The only medicine against these ferments is the rapid construction of genuine European unification. Now, there are problems. There was an article just recently showing the fact that as the situation has continued to build, it discussed the European Union. This is from the International Herald Tribune, an article back in April. And point is made that the new Europe that's unfolding before our eyes is not a great joint effort by the rank-and-file national populations. It's been a project by politicians, bureaucrats, and visionaries. Now the people have to be sold on it, or it could be stalled. A work in progress, but going nowhere very fast. And so the question arises of how to swing citizens of Europe behind the next European Union treaty already looms large. Now, you see, there's a problem that they're confronting as these events unfold, as many of the crises that involve Europe, that involves a disillusionment that many of the people have, because there were high hopes. There were great dreams. There was excitement in the aftermath of the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the fall of communism. There were high expectations that have not been met. They haven't been met anywhere in Europe. They haven't been met in Russia. They haven't been met in the other nations that used to be behind the Iron Curtain. And they haven't been met even in Germany, where East and West Germany have reunited. So, on the one hand, there are problems, and there are growing problems that scare many of the leaders of seeing sort of a pendulum swing back to the other direction. They recognize and feel that they have the solution, that as Giovanni Spadolini, who was twice Prime Minister of Italy and President of the Italian Senate currently, his opinion is that the only medicine against these ferments is the rapid construction of a genuine European unification. But how do you bring that about? Part of the problem is the leadership there. In fact, it's interesting to give you one more quote. This is a quote from Winston Churchill. Nearly 60 years ago, Winston Churchill attacked the leaders of his day over their head-in-the-sand attitude toward Hitler's Germany. And here Churchill's comment was, "So they go on in strange paradox, decided only to be undecided, resolved only to be irresolute, adamant for drift, solid for fluidity, all-powerful to be impotent." Much has changed in Europe since Churchill's day. Much has not. And that, of course, is the problem, because on the one hand, you have problems, you have crises, some of which are the result of natural disasters, some of which are the results of just age-old problems and difficulties and strife between various religious and ethnic groups. On the one hand, you have problems and crises that are building. On the other hand, you have leaders and positions who are the ones to respond to those crises, and they have not effectively done so. Many of them feel the solution is to bring about the solution for the problems in Europe. Many of them feel is to bring about a union there, a more solidly constructed union. The idea even of the uncertainties of the U.S. financial situation to launch a European currency that would replace the dollar as the international means of exchange. It's one thing for some of them to be agreed on. It's another thing to have the support of the population. Many of these leaders they've not effectively marshaled the population behind them. So what are they going to do? It's obvious that there are things more than just simply what bureaucrats can put together that is going to successfully bring some of these things about. Now, we see the stage being set in various areas, and there is ultimately a religious aspect that has really not come on the scene or has not, let's say, had its impact at this time. That real return to a religious fervor that you see glimpses of in various parts of the world, various areas, various societies, but it's not something that has had a major impact in Europe yet. But everything in its time. Everything in its time. Now, we look and we see these kinds of things, and we see these events that are going on, and we see the fact that they tie in very much with what Jesus Christ warned His disciples of in Matthew chapter 24 when they came to Him privately and asked Him about the end of the age and the time when He would come as Messiah. And He warned them not to be deceived. He told them that various things would happen, various crises, various problems, many of which have occurred on and on down through time. But He talked about a convergence of events. And He gave a warning in Matthew 24:10, a warning to the people of God. Because you see, as we see all of these things transpiring and building on the world scene, that's all well and good. But the question that we have to face and the issue that we have to address is, what does it mean for us personally? What does God expect and what does He tell us needs to be our response? What is it we need to be doing? The fact of these things is that our part, what God expects of us, what God warns us of. You see, the most important aspect as we see all of these things shaping up, the important aspect for us is what should be and what must be our response. Now, Christ warned that in the context of the end time, three things would affect many of God's people. The first thing He said in verse 10 was, many shall be offended and betray one another and hate one another. That in the context of a crisis looming, why do people betray one another? Why do they hate one another? Because they have been offended. They've gotten their feelings hurt. They have nursed a resentment. It might be about anything. But they've held on to various resentments. They've nursed a grudge. And as those resentments have built up, when circumstances came about in a certain way, then we find many will betray one another and hate one another. Christ is this is a warning to the disciples. Many will be offended. Many will stumble. They'll take offense. They'll get upset about something. They'll have a bad attitude toward others. And in the right set of circumstances, they will hate and betray one another. People who love one another don't hate one another, and they don't betray one another. You see, there's a solution here. You're not people who have an attitude of love and forgiveness from the heart don't hold resentments. Because you can't hold resentment and forgiveness in the same heart. There's not room for both. Forgiving attitude. The word forgive, if you look it up in the New Testament, the word forgive means to turn loose or to let go. It's the word that is used when you read about Peter and Andrew and James and John. They were there at their father's fishing boats. And Christ said, "Come and follow me." And we're told that they left the boats and followed Him. Well, if you look up that word for leaving, it's the same word that in other contexts is translated forgive. In other words, they turned their back on the boat and walked away to follow Christ. To forgive is to turn our back on offenses, on hurts, and to walk away. To turn away and to walk away. Not to harbor them, not to hold them, not to let them sort of sit and fester, sort of feed them, fertilize them, Water them and let them grow. The Scripture warns us in the book of Hebrews about a root of bitterness. Beware lest any root of bitterness springing up defile you, trouble you, whereby many be defiled. You know, the root is the source from which the plant grows. The root of bitterness is resentments. That is the root stock from which bitterness grows. And if it's not uprooted, it'll grow. Christ said many will be offended. They'll be offended because they don't have an attitude of love and forgiveness. They'll be offended. They'll hold and harbor resentments, and those will give rise to bitterness, to hatred, and will result ultimately in betrayal in times of crisis. The solution to it, and the only solution, is to root out resentments and bitterness. To root those things out, to realize one of the most important things that we can have is an attitude of love and forgiveness. We're told in verse 11, many false prophets shall rise and deceive many, and because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. Okay, false prophets will rise and they will deceive many. Many will be offended, many will be deceived. See, you have to have, first and foremost, an attitude of love and compassion and forgiveness for one another. You also have to have a love of the truth and a faithfulness to it, because otherwise you'll be deceived. We read about those who are deceived because they retained not the love of the truth. Now, you know, we've gone through some things and we've seen many be deceived. Do you think all of that's totally fulfilled? And say, well, I can't be deceived. But boy, I passed the test and I've just got a grease slide right on into the kingdom from here. Brethren, Satan's not through. Satan is not through. There are going to be many who will be deceived and go off in various directions. And others, verse 12, will simply become lukewarm. Their love will grow cold. They will lose the zeal and the intensity. The spark sort of goes out. They're surrounded by all of the iniquity, by all of the lawlessness, by all the selfishness and self-centeredness. They get sidetracked. They get misfocused. And their love grows cold. Lukewarm is a spot you have to pass on the way down. If you're going from hot to cold, you've got to pass through lukewarm in order to get there, don't you? If your love is waxing cold, growing cold, it's headed the wrong direction. The entire final phase of the church is characterized by being in that place, in that location, heading from hot to cold. They're heading the wrong direction. They're tepid. They've lost that zeal, that intensity, that fervent love. So we see that Christ specifically warned that many will harbor resentments and become offended. Many will be deceived, and many will grow lukewarm. But he that shall endure, remain faithful unto the end, the same shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness to all nations, then shall the end come. There's a work to be done. There's something we have in front of us. Jesus Christ went on here in the book of Matthew, on over in chapter latter part of verse 24, chapter 24. In verse 42, he says, "Watch therefore. You don't know what hour your Lord does come. Know this, if the good man of the house had known in what watch the thief would come, he would have watched. Wouldn't have allowed his house to be broken into. Therefore be you also ready in such hour as you think not, the Son of Man comes." Now this word watch means to be alert, to stay awake, to be alert, to be sleepless, to be watchful, to be sober, and awake, aware of surroundings. We're told to watch. And that's the sense of it. You know, sometimes people have gotten their focus and they will watch. You know, that means I've got to read this magazine, I've got to watch this television news show. That's not what it's talking about. That's all well and good, but that's not what it's talking about. You can go through and you do a word search all the way through, and you'll find over and over and over again that it means to take heed. It means to be alert. It means to be awake. And one of the primary things that it has to do is in terms of ourselves. What is it saying? Watch. Why do you watch? Because you don't know exactly the time. If you're not alert and aware, then things will sneak up on you. Now, what is it that's going to sneak up on you? You know, these events are going to happen and they're going to unfold. The key to watching is not whether you know so many months in advance. The key is what kind of condition are you in? Because these things are going to happen. And as we come on down here in the context, verse 44 says, "Be you also ready." Now, what does that mean? Does that mean you're in your bunker and you've got you're sort of like the free men out in Montana, and you're in your bunker and you've got all your guns and you're be you also ready, boy. I've got my fallout shelter dug. I've got, great stocks of food laid up and guns and ammunition. I'm ready. Well, I'll tell you what, you go back and read the prophets and you find out that that's not going to solve your problem any way. Talks about some of these things that are going to come. People are going to be running out of caves. People in the bunkers are going to be trying to get out of them. And be you also ready. What? Ready for what? Well, let's see. Be ready, for in such an hour as you think not the Son of Man comes. Who then is a faithful and wise servant? Oh, how are you ready? You're ready by being a faithful and a wise servant. To be ready means that we are ready to meet Jesus Christ. That's what we're to be ready for. Christ will take care of the bad guys. The question is not, are these things going to happen? Yes, they are. Is Christ going to return? Yes, He is. Those things aren't questions. The question is, what will be our circumstance when it happens? It's going to happen just as surely as the rising of tomorrow's sun. The events that are laid out in the pages of Scripture are going to come to pass. What is not set in stone is whether or not we will be spiritually ready and prepared as individuals. That's what He's telling us to watch, to be alert, to be awake, be sober, be vigilant. Don't go to sleep spiritually. Be you ready, such an hour as you think not, the Son of Man comes. Who then is a faithful and wise servant whom his Lord has made ruler over his household to give them meat in due season? Blessed is that servant whom his Lord, when He comes, shall find so doing. Truly I say, He'll make him ruler over all his goods. The servant who is doing what his master told him to do will be blessed. The evil servant who said in his heart, my Lord delays His coming, I've got a lot of time. What does he do as a result of that? You see, his idea that the day of reckoning is far off. Well, the result is, verse 49, he begins to smite his fellow servants and to eat and drink with the drunken. So he begins to imbibe out of the same cup that has made all the world drunk. Go back and read in Revelation 17 of the great fallen woman astride the beast, the revived Roman Empire. And you can go through. You've hopefully been reading the series that we've been running in the World Ahead. There's one more yet to come. It'll be in the July-August issue of the World Ahead. And then we've got a booklet coming out. Ought to be out before feast time. That will include other information and be a more detailed booklet on the subject. But what he says, he begins to smite his fellow servant and to eat and drink with the drunken. You know, in Revelation 17, we're told that the great whore has a cup in her hand, full of filthiness and abominations. And we're told that all the world, all the nations have become intoxicated. They have taken in of the contents of that cup of the false religion that has intoxicated them. It's left them, it's taken them away from an understanding of the truth. So here we find there will be those who smite their fellow servants. They're wrangling and arguing and mad and having this attitude, and they are taking in of things that originate with those that are spiritually drunken. They're taking in. They may not be as drunk as some of the others, but they have lost their edge, their sharpness. And the Lord of that servant will come in a day that he looks not, when he's not aware. You know, we are told to be spiritually awake, spiritually alert, spiritually aware. We're told to be conscious of these things. It's laid out right here in Matthew 24. If we go back to Mark 13. Mark 13, let's notice up here. Verse 27, speaking of the return of Christ, He'll send His angels. They'll gather together the elect from the four winds, from the uttermost part of the earth to the uttermost part of heaven. In other words, all over the place. Now learn a parable of the fig tree. When her branch is yet tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. In like manner, when you shall see these things come to pass, know that it is near, even at the doors. Truly I say unto you that this generation shall not pass till all these things be done. In other words, these events will all transpire within the lifetime of a single generation. Heaven and earth shall pass away, my words won't. Of that day and that hour knows no man, no, not the angels which are in heaven, neither the Son, but the Father. Take you heed, watch and pray, for you know not when the time is. To watch and to pray. Now what does that mean? That doesn't mean to be glued to your television set watching CNN. It means being alert. Being alert. Being awake. Being sober. Being vigilant. And it certainly has to do with being alert and vigilant about ourselves, because there are three things. We're warned that many will become offended, many will become deceived, and many will grow lukewarm. Now, Paul says you can know all prophecy. Back in 1 Corinthians 13. You can know everything there is to know. You can have every intricate detail figured out. And if you have not love, it profits you nothing. He didn't say it profits you a little bit, or it'll be, you're halfway home. He said if you have all knowledge, you understand all prophecy, you understand all mysteries, you do all of these great services, and you are willing even to suffer martyrdom. You can go through and read it in 1 Corinthians 13. Though you do all of these things and have not love, it profits nothing. We're to watch. We're to be alert. We're to be vigilant. In terms of our relationship with God, having a sense of urgency. A sense of urgency involves our response. If we feel a sense of urgency, then we recognize that there are things we need to do. Our sense of urgency isn't going to affect the speed with which things happen in the outside world. Our sense of urgency is for ourselves. It is for dealing in terms of our relationship with God. We're told to watch, to be alert, to be awake, to be sober, to be vigilant, and to pray always. Really seeking to draw close to God and not to go to sleep. Not to have this ho-hum sort of an attitude that we don't have to, we've somehow got plenty of time to get our act together. No, Christ said, take heed, watch and pray. You know not when the time is. The Son of Man is as a man taking a far journey, who left his house, gave authority to his servants, to every man his work, and commanded the porter to watch. Watch you therefore. You know not when the master of the house comes, at evening, at midnight, at cock-crowing, or in the morning, lest coming suddenly, he finds you sleeping. You see, that's the danger. If you go to sleep spiritually, then things begin to happen. I say unto you all, watch. The opposite of watch is to sleep. he draws the analogy of somebody who was left to watch for the master's coming. And he went to sleep at the switch and he wasn't awake. He was not able to respond. You know, when you are suddenly awakened out of a deep sleep, it's sort of hard to respond. It takes time to sort of collect your thoughts. What we're told is when the crisis comes, things will happen very quickly. If you're not spiritually prepared, you won't have time to get it all together. You know, God doesn't give us some exact time scale. He could have. He could have said, you know, this is the date. You know, what people would have done, they'd have circled that on the calendar, tried to set the alarm clock, you know, for a little bit before and figured they'd sleep up until then. God says we can't afford to go to sleep. We have to, and you know what happens when people start imbibing and getting drunk? Well, they get dozy. It's hard to stay awake. And when they sleep, they're asleep in a real stupor. And so Christ warned in Matthew 24 about those who were eating and drinking with the drunken. And of course, obviously that could refer to just a wild, ungodly lifestyle, but I think in the spiritual sense it refers to taking in and imbibing false teaching and false doctrine and these false ideas that originate with the great Mother Church. That's when you go back to Revelation 17. So Christ says that we're to watch, we're to take heed. Now He said, learn the parable of the fig tree. You know, you can tell when the season is coming on. You see the leaves turning. You see the new growth coming out. You know the seasons are changing. So He said, and Christ gave us the things to be aware of, to be conscious of, to look for. The things that He laid out in Matthew 24. You know, people, you can go around and you can look for all sorts of things, but if you're not paying attention to the things Christ said, then you're looking at the wrong things. And we have to, certainly, to be conscious of ourselves and our relationship with God, our being watchful in a watchful state of mind, and an alert state of mind, and being conscious of the things that Christ said and seeing these things shape up. Now, let's go on. Let's come on back to Luke chapter 21. In Luke chapter 21. In verse 36. Well, he said, notice in verse 34, he says, take heed to yourselves. This is the same word for watch, by the way. Take heed to yourselves. Watch. Lest at any time your hearts be overcharged with surfeiting and drunkenness and cares of this life, so that day comes upon you unaware. So what are we to watch? Well, one of the main things is that we get caught up in the world, that we, the cares of this life, that we're overtaken by these things. The day comes upon us unawares because we've gotten our mind off of God and on to other things. For as a snare shall it come on all them that dwell on the face of the whole earth. You ever set a snare for an animal? You know, it's not set out to where it's supposed to be real obvious. It's there. And when they step in it, you know, there it is. They're caught. It catches them by surprise because they're not aware of it. They're not looking. What is it we're to be looking for? What is it we're to watch? Right here it tells us we're to be careful lest our hearts be overcharged without boozing it up, the cares of this life, partying and carrying on, lest we get so caught up in the world that we lose sight of what's really important. So he says in verse 36, watch ye therefore, and pray always that you may be accounted worthy to escape all these things that shall come to pass and to stand before the Son of Man. To be worthy to escape has to do with a spiritual condition. with a spiritual condition, with your state spiritually. You can know every intricacy of every detailed prophecy. You can be aware of all the ins and outs. But if your heart and your attitude isn't right before God, you're not going to be accounted worthy of anything except trouble. You see, why does God allow these events to come? To shake up and to wake up His people. God allows the calamities to come on Israel and even on many, the church, the whole Laodicean church. Why does He allow those things to come? Because He loves them and they need to be awakened. It has to do with a spiritual state of mind, and that's the key. A relationship with God, knowing God, walking with God, having a deep personal relationship with God which will carry through in our relationship with one another. And John says if you don't love your neighbor, if you don't love your brother whom you have seen, how can you claim to love God whom you haven't seen? It won't work. Love for God and love for neighbor is tied together. You can't separate. You can't say, well, I love God, but I don't like people. Well, if you don't like people made in the image of God, then you don't like God either. That's what He says back there in 1 John. You can go back and read it for yourself. You see, we can't afford to have resentments and hostilities and bitterness. We can't afford to harbor an unforgiving spirit because it sets us up for attitudes of resentment and hatred. We're told to watch, to be alert, to be aware, because if we're doing that, if we are deeply conscious and we are spiritually awake and we are praying, then we won't have to go through some of those things. We'll be able to stand before Him. Now, we could go on. I mentioned the article in U.S. News in terms of the situation in Europe. We know what's going to transpire in that regard. Revelation 17 describes a creature that has sitting upon it what is described in Revelation 17:1, a great whore that sits upon many waters. Now, you don't have to wonder what the waters are, because down in verse 15, we're told that the waters where she sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. So this is a great multinational institution. It is a religious institution. We're told in verse 5 that it is the outgrowth of mystery, Babylon the Great, and it's the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. Now, as I'm not going to go back through in detail the upcoming article in the July-August World Ahead will go through Revelation 17 in somewhat detail. But one of the things that I've been attempting to do in this series is to show the necessity of building line upon line to understand the Scriptures. All down through time, people jump to conclusions. That's the only exercise a lot of people get, jumping to conclusions about anything and everything. Now, one of the things that has, in effect, given prophecy a bad name and accounts for the attitude that so many in the world around have when you mention Bible prophecy is because so many who claim to be talking about Bible prophecy have jumped to conclusions. They start at the wrong end. They look around and they see things on the world scene. They start with that and try to find it in the Bible. That's the wrong direction. I don't care what period of time you're in. If you look at the world conditions, you'll find something in the Bible that talks about it, because the Bible describes all kinds of conditions. And there have always been problems. There have always been various things on the world scene. And so they jump to conclusions, whatever it is. Back in the 50s and the 60s, it was international communism. Boy, that was the big thing. It was interesting. I passed This past Sabbath we were down in New Orleans, and we passed by a church building. It was a Baptist church building there in New Orleans, and it struck a bell because I remembered years ago, this would have been over 30 years ago, that I was down in New Orleans, and I remember going there. The minister had gotten quite a bit of notoriety. He was on the evening news. This was, of course, back in the 60s, and there was communism was something that was in the forefront of people's attention. And he had put up padlocks, big chains with padlocks on his church building, and put signs up there, closed by order of the state and all this stuff, to sort of give the impression of what it would be like if the Russians came in and they were going to close down the churches. And he was supposed to give a sermon on prophecy, on Bible prophecy. I was down there working for a man that summer, and we watched it on television, and of course, fellow was getting a lot of attention. I think he had his building packed that evening, that Sunday evening. He was going to tell us about Bible prophecy, and he was, Russia and prophecy, and all of these things. And so he had all this stuff up, and it got attention, news media attention, and we went there, and I remember listening to him, and I was reading Mr. Armstrong's literature at the time. And as he was going through Ezekiel, and he was talking about Russians coming in and attacking the United States and all this stuff, I knew that wasn't right because he had the time setting wrong. What he did was he looked at the world scene and he found a place in Ezekiel that talked about the Russians, and he said, "Hey, they're coming." And he just pulled it right out of its context. Well, I saw through that even at that time because I'd read what Mr. Armstrong said, and he'd gone through it verse by verse and showed the time setting. And it didn't fit with what this man was there. And I saw it was interesting, in going by there. In fact, I saw his name still out there. He must be getting on up there by now. But things trigger and bring back memories. There have always been all of these people who they thought they had the answer, and whoever comes on the scene, if it back. When it was Nasser back in the 50s and 60s, there were those who knew, he was the king of the South. He was this or that. Well, Nasser's been dead for years. Saddam Hussein comes along. This one or that one comes along. People are quick to immediately try to take today and fit it in. That's the wrong direction. You have to start at the beginning and come through. That's why if you're going to start to understand Revelation 17, you have to start in Daniel 2. If you don't start in Daniel 2 and work your way down systematically, you'll never understand Revelation 17. If you start with what you see on yesterday's news and try to fit it into Revelation 17, you're starting from the wrong direction, and there's no telling what you're going to come up with. People start at the wrong direction. You have to start with Daniel 2, and you have to work your way down systematically, or else you'll come to the wrong conclusion. That's the reason Mr. Armstrong understood the outline decades ago, because he started at the right spot. He started at the beginning and worked his way down. We've all speculated about the timing of it from time to time, but you can go back. I could show you the outline. In fact, when we print the Who is the Beast booklet, we'll print it in there. It came out of the July 1934 Plain Truth. Mr. Armstrong outlined the course of prophecy right on down, realizing as he drew the outline that there was yet to arise a 10-nation union in Europe after Mussolini. And he did that in 1934. He understood, because you see, he understood where he started at the beginning, and so when he by the time he got down to the events of his day, he realized that he wasn't to the seventh resurrection yet. He wasn't to the end time in terms of the portions that were fulfilled by Mussolini and by some of those events that resulted in World War II. He didn't know how long it would take to occur, but the outline was correct. And that's the thing, is we recognize that God has given us information so that we might have a sense of the times in which we are. Now, there are going to be those who charge off in every direction, that claim to have all sorts of things figured out. Christ talked about that in Matthew 24. People saying, here, go to the desert, go to the mountains, here he is, there he is. All of these things, they've got it all figured out. Well, the Scriptures tell us what we need to be about doing. We have a job. Christ said, blessed is that servant whom when his Lord shall come shall find him so doing. Doing what? Doing the work of God. God has given us a job to do. And what He's going to be pleased with is finding us busily about doing the job. Not sitting around in idle speculation, but doing the job. Ezekiel Chapter 2, he said in verse 3, Son of man, I send you to the children of Israel, to a rebellious nation that's rebelled. And he goes on and he talks about that. He tells him, chapter 3, verse 4, go get you to the house of Israel, speak with my words unto them. Down in verse 17, he says, Son of man, I've made you a watchman to the house of Israel. Hear the word at my mouth and give them warning. Now what warning is it? When I say to the wicked, you shall surely die, you give him not warning, nor speak to warn the wicked from his wicked way to save his life. The warning is a warning to repent. A warning that the judgment of God is coming and that wickedness will result in calamity. You see, the warning is directed not at giving every detail of the events that are going to happen. God gives us an outline. There's some things we're not going to fully understand until we're right in the middle of it. But what we can understand from the beginning is that walking with God is the key. That righteousness results in blessings and disobedience results in curses. The warning message is a warning to turn from sin. A warning of the judgment of God that is going to come on a nation that refuses to heed its Maker. In Ezekiel chapter 33, he talks about Ezekiel 33:2, Son of man, speak to the children of my people and say unto them, when I bring the sword upon a land, if the people of the land take a man of their coast and set him for their watchman, and he sees the sword come and he blows the trumpet and warns them, whoever hears the sound, if he doesn't take warning, the sword comes and takes him away, his blood will be upon his own head. Now, talks about taking warning and not taking warning. Verse 7, Son of man, I've set you a watchman to the house of Israel, therefore they'll hear the word at my mouth and warn them from me. When I say to the wicked, here's the warning, O wicked man, you shall surely die. That's the warning. Wicked man, you shall surely die, if you do not speak to warn the wicked from his way. See, the warning is a warning of the consequences of continued sin. That's the warning message. It's an indictment of the state of the nation, of the sins of the people. If you speak not to warn the wicked from his way, that wicked man shall die in his iniquity, but his blood will I require at your hand. If you warn the wicked out of his way to turn from it, and if he doesn't turn from it, he'll die in his iniquity. Then he goes on down. In verse 11, as I live, says the Lord God, I have no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but that the wicked should turn from his way and live. Turn you from your evil way, for why will you die, O house of Israel? You go on through and you read what it's talking about. It's a warning that deals with what, you warn people about what they can do something about. What can you do something about? Can you do something you can do to prevent some of these things that are going to happen on the world scene? What you can do something about is your relationship with God. Now, we see that there are things on the world scene that are converging right into the pattern that Christ gave. And we have an outline, a basic outline. Not all the details filled in, but we have a basic outline. And we need to be aware, we need to understand that man is not going to solve his own problems, and that God's judgment is going to come on this nation. And we also need to understand that there is something we can do about ourselves. We can turn to God, we can walk with God, we can seek Him with all of our heart. And there is only one thing that will provide our deliverance, and that is our relationship with God. You put your trust in anything else, and you're going to perish. Because God is the only source of protection and salvation and help that we have. God wants us to understand that. He wants us to know that. And the only protection, the only source of help we're going to have in the times ahead of us is really walking with God and knowing God. You know, we come on back to the book of 1 Thessalonians. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. Now we have described here a problem in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. Let's notice what the problem is. 1 Thessalonians 5:1. Of the times and the seasons, brethren, you have no need that I write unto you. Yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so comes as a thief in the night. When they shall say peace and safety, sudden destruction shall come upon them as a woman in travail. A woman as travail upon a woman and a child, and they shall not escape. But you, brethren, are not in darkness, that that day should overtake you as a thief. Now I want you to notice something. There's a switch here, verses 3 and 4. Verse 3 is the third person. They shall say peace and safety. They shall say peace and safety. Sudden destruction comes upon them. Verse 4, you, that's second person. See? Verse 3 is third person. Verse 4 is second person. You, brethren, are not in darkness, that that day should overtake you as a thief. You are all the children of light and the children of the day. We're not of the night nor of darkness. Therefore let us not sleep as do others, but let us watch and be sober. To watch and be sober is linked together. They that sleep, sleep in the night. They that are drunken in the night. Let us who are of the day be sober, putting on the breastplate of faith and love, and for a helmet the hope of salvation. For God has not appointed us to wrath, but to obtain salvation by our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us, that whether we wake or sleep, we should live together with Him. Wherefore comfort yourselves together and edify one another, even as you do also. Now, how are you to edify, to build up one another? By, what does He tell us to do? If we're of the day, if we're sober, then we need to do what? Put on the breastplate of love and faith, and for a helmet the hope of salvation. If we're alert, if we're watching, that's what we're doing. How do you get prepared? Well, the soldier needs to get his armor on. Put on your breastplate and your helmet. Now, he's not talking about your army helmet. He's not talking about your bulletproof vest. He's talking about the breastplate of faith and love. And for a helmet, the hope of salvation. What is it that's going to protect you? Faith, love, hope. Does that sound familiar? Faith, hope, and love. These three. The greatest of these is love. That sort of sounds like that maybe Paul talked about. You know, he talked about that back in 1 Corinthians 13. Faith, hope, and love, these three. The greatest of these is love. And then he went on into explaining what real love was all about. When you go through the book of James, you're reading about faith. When you go through 1 and 2 Peter, you're reading about the hope of salvation. When you go through 1, 2, and 3 John, you're reading about love. God built those in, that pattern in. If we're awake, if we're alert spiritually, then we're going to be putting on the breastplate of love and faith. And for a helmet to protect our minds, the hope of salvation, our focus is going to be on what? Our focus is going to be the hope of salvation. That's what makes it all worthwhile. All the ups and downs, the trials, the difficulties, we're focused on the hope of salvation. You see, to be aware of what's going on in the world today is well and good, but if all you're aware of what's going on in the world today, you're facing some awfully depressing things. You can just look around in the community. You can see what's happening. You can't pick up the paper without reading about all kind of horrible things. They got, it seems like almost every day you're reading about child molesters, and we're talking little tiny children. Horrible things. You're reading about natural disasters. You're reading about plagues. You're reading about a terrible thing. I tell you, if all you do is look at that, you get pretty depressed. How do you avoid getting discouraged and despondent? You put on for a helmet the hope of salvation. As we go through the events that lie ahead of us, how do we avoid becoming just overwhelmed with depression and despondency and just becoming so down? Because we have for a helmet to protect our head, we have the hope of salvation. We're looking beyond the moment to the future, and we understand that the God of heaven is going to set up a kingdom that will never be removed. And we have an opportunity to share in that kingdom, to be part of it. We put on for a breastplate, the breastplate of faith and love, trusting God, walking with God, an attitude of love and concern for one another. So we read here, and there's a warning. He says, look, these things are going to catch the world by surprise because the world is caught up in the pursuit of everyday life. People are caught up in their own selfish endeavor. And when their world goes awry, they're going to be caught by surprise. And they're not going to have a relationship with God. A lot of people consider themselves religious, but they don't let it affect the way they live. Doesn't really have much impact on their marriage or their job. Well, they may go to church. People will tell you, well, look, now, I'm all for religion. I'm not against religion, but I don't let it interfere with my life. Well, they ought to, shouldn't they? If it doesn't interfere with your life, then you don't have much. But you see, they're caught up in their own selfish endeavors, and they don't have the big picture. And they think that everything's going to work out fine, and it's going to catch them by surprise. You, brethren, are not in darkness. That day should not overtake you as a thief. It doesn't have to. Now, how does a thief overtake you? A thief catches you unawares. If you're close to God, if you've got the breastplate of love and faith and the helmet of salvation on, then you're not going to be caught unawares. You're not going to be caught unawares because you are prepared. You are spiritually prepared every day. And you're not going to be caught. You're not in darkness. We have a warning. We know the things that are going to happen, not necessarily the exact moment that it's going to occur, but we have the warning. We know what's going to transpire. And we need to be, therefore, spiritually awake. We understand, why are some not going to be spiritually awake? We read it back in Matthew 24:49 about how they will begin to eat and drink with the drunken. They will begin to take in all of these things, and it will affect what happens. Let's conclude back here in 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 13. He says, wherefore gird up the loins of your mind and be sober, and hope to the end for the grace that is to be brought unto you at the revelation of Jesus Christ, as obedient children, not fashioning yourselves according to the former lust in your ignorance, but as He which is called you is holy, so be you holy in all manner of conduct. Because it is written, be you holy, for I am holy. God's desire is that we become like Him. We need to be ready. To gird up has to do with getting ready to move quickly or to be ready to take a journey. They normally wore loose flowing robes, and when they were going to be out, particularly if they were going to have to move quickly or a soldier going into battle, they girded that up and put a belt around to hold it there. They were prepared. It was used to make reference to being ready, to being prepared. Gird up the loins of your mind. Be mentally prepared. Be sober. Be awake. Hope to the end. Have your mind focused on the hope of salvation. And what's going to happen when Christ returns is the great salvation that God has in store for us. And if that's really what's on our mind, if we're prepared, if we're alert, if we're focused on what God has in store, then we will have a motivation not to simply drift along, be like we used to be, but recognize the need to be holy, for God is holy, to become like God. On back in chapter 4, here in 1 Peter, chapter 4, verse 7. He says, the end of all things, the apocalypse, the revealing of all things is at hand. Be you therefore sober and watch unto prayer. Be alert. Pay attention. Above all things, have fervent love among yourselves, for love shall cover the multitude of sins. Use hospitality to one another without grudging. Utilize the gifts that God has given. Have fervent love. See, that's tied in. That's one of the great warnings and admonitions. We're told on back here in chapter 5 of 1 Peter, we're told in verse 5, likewise you younger, submit yourselves unto the elder. Yes, all of you be subject one to another, and be clothed with humility, for God resists the proud and gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that He may exalt you in due time. Casting all your care upon Him, for He cares for you. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil, as a roaring lion, walks about seeking whom he may devour. Be sober, be vigilant. Watch. Be on watch, because the devil walks about seeking whom he may devour, whom resist steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same afflictions are accomplished in your brethren that are in the world. We all go through problems and difficulties. But see, God, verse 10, the God of all grace, who has called us unto His eternal glory by Christ Jesus, after that you have suffered a while, make you perfect, establish, strengthen, and settle you. God allows us to go through difficulties and trials and tests to develop His character within us. We're told, brethren, in Romans chapter 13, verse 11, knowing the time, that it is high time to awake out of sleep, for now is our salvation nearer than when we believed. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. Let us therefore cast off the works of darkness, and let us put on the armor of light. Let us walk honestly as in the day, not in rioting and drunkenness, not in chambering and wantonness, not in strife and envy, but put you on the Lord Jesus Christ. Make not provision for the flesh to fulfill the lust thereof. How do we walk honestly? How do we respond to the realization the night is far spent? What do we need to do in a positive way? Put on the Lord Jesus Christ. Walk with God. Let Christ live His life in you. Brethren, we are living in momentous times. And God tells us what to do to be prepared. Now, you know, the world is, for the most part, oblivious to what's going on. Those that recognize that there are crises building tend to be looked upon as sort of a nut fringe. But you know, those who know, there are many in the secular world, maybe not many in the sense of approaching a majority, but there are sizable numbers in the secular world who know that there are crises coming. But you know what? They're as spiritually unprepared as those who don't know that Christ is the coming. Because the only preparation that's going to matter, the only preparation that's going to count, is going to be the one right here, verse 14. Put you on the Lord Jesus Christ and make not provision for the flesh. Don't seek to preserve the flesh. You put on Jesus Christ and everything else will take care of itself. If your focus is on making provision for the flesh and fulfilling the appetites of the flesh, the desires of the flesh, that won't solve the problem. Put on the Lord Jesus Christ. We live in momentous times. And God gives us warnings. Warnings directed toward His disciples, His people. Brethren, we must take heed to those warnings. Because we're living in the times that are talked about and that are described. And these things are there for our admonition. That we might take heed. That we might draw close to God and walk with God. That we might be alert and sober and walking with God. And if we do that, if we put on the breastplate of faith and love and for a helmet the hope of salvation, then we have nothing to fear, everything to look forward to.